Hi, everyone. It's Susan Hunt-Stevens, and welcome to WeSpire Live. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. So settle in, whether you're joining us at breakfast from the West Coast, lunch on the East Coast, or getting ready for hopefully a little bit of happy hour in the EU. So I'm thrilled today that we are joined by Chris Heysel, who's the head of advisory at South Pole. And as we are getting settled in, we were just sharing that we are both sustainable building and design geeks. He's a former civil engineer. I did my degree in sustainable design, and it's kind of fun to see that we've come to very different careers, but all passionate about the same thing. So welcome, everyone. It is great to be here. It's hard to believe it is the end of March and that April is coming, and we're going to get some big news in April, potentially from the SEC, Chris, right? What do you think's going to happen? What do you
That's right. Everyone's waiting.
Any Vegas bets right now on this?
I'm not a betting man, but if I had to, I would say it will likely go through with small amendments, and then it will likely be immediately challenged. And then from there, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what we're talking about, the SEC has been seeking comments and feedback on measurement for greenhouse gas emissions and mandatory reporting of those for scope 1 and 2 for sure. And then scope 3 is included under some caveats, right, Chris? Do you want to tell everybody who's here what that scope 3, especially since that's the topic for today's webinar, sort of what they're talking about and whether you think that's where the amendments may come in?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely the hot button issue. So scope 3 emissions, as people know, it's your value chain emissions. And there's different types of filers that report to the SEC. And depending on what type of filer you are, how large your business is, essentially defined by a couple different metrics like public float and revenue. Depending on those factors, you will have to report scope 3 emissions. It's tiered out by time, and it's also captured under safe harbor provisions, meaning there's limited liability there, but just the fact that you have to disclose those scope 3 emissions in such detail, including the methodology you're using, it will be a drastic change, I think, for many businesses, that detailed of reporting. So I think that's what's got people talking.
Absolutely. And it's certainly been the one where I think I've heard more from people about what that might be the piece that doesn't go through. But as recently as last month at GreenBiz, I think the general consensus is that if you have declared a goal around scope 3, that you will need and be held to a higher standard for reporting against that. And now the scope 3 includes the employee-related emissions component. And I will share an anecdote, which is that I was talking to several clients, many who sort of feel like scope 3 is the tsunami that very few companies are prepared for. And one shared an anecdote that the way scope 3 employee-related emissions has been measured historically is that they send a survey out to they have tens of thousands of employees. They get about 100 to 150 responses back. They take that data and they extrapolate. And that is how they've been doing their scope 3 employee-related emissions reporting. And the concern is that that isn't going to cut it. What are your thoughts? Is that common experience? Is that what you hear others have been doing as well? Is that the piece that you think is going to require more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think aside from employee-related emissions, the challenge of data availability and data quality within scope 3 is just a systematic issue for a lot of companies. I always try to equate it from, imagine if you tried to start doing your financial accounting, you went around your business asking everyone for receipts, and everyone said, oh, I didn't know I needed to keep those. So it's just a tough ask for a lot of people within businesses to collect this data and provide this data. And so it's going to be a real challenge. And so I don't want to besmirch the people that are making progress, because we don't want perfection to be the enemy of progress. Starting with spend-based emissions and starting with extrapolations is fantastic, but having clear plans on how to drive more granularity on those emissions, especially the emission sources that are the largest piece of your scope 3, is something that I think a lot of businesses are hopefully driving towards, and really are going to make their decarbonization efforts a lot easier.
Yeah. And what types of businesses is scope 3 material for, particularly, and particularly the employee component of scope 3? Because obviously, if you're a giant manufacturing company or an oil and gas company, your employee related scope 3 emissions just aren't that material. This is not that big a deal. But who has to think about this most?
Sure. Yeah, so well said. I think any professional services firm, or most professional services firm, they will see, let's say, their employee related emissions, which I guess we're classifying really here as employee commuting and business travel, as larger portions of their scope 3. That said, I sort of always try to think about every part of your emissions is partly an employee related emission, right? Because you have procurement teams that are making decisions on suppliers and materials that you use, right? So even in these large manufacturing companies, they're all related to decisions that your employees are making. And so engagement with those employees can make a real difference in understanding the emissions as well as trying to mitigate the emissions.
Yeah. So Chris, when we were talking earlier, I said, let's explain what you do in human. And so for folks on the webinar today, Chris leads the advisory practices. That's the consulting side of South Pole. South Pole is a firm that got started in 2005 and is a real leader in sustainability consulting, but also in carbon project development with over 1,000 projects. And for those of you who are WeSpire customers, you will know them because South Pole is WeSpire's partner for our employee carbon management solution. So the background for those of you not familiar with WeSpire is that a couple of years ago, I think many of our forward-thinking leader customers saw the writing on the wall that scope 3 employee-related emissions was going to need a better solution, and asked if we could work to develop a better carbon measurement solution really focused on an employee component, that the consumer calculators that were out there didn't ask the right questions to get at things, but particularly in a hybrid environment and in a move to a telecommuting environment. And so if we go rewind 3 years, it's hard to believe it was 3 years this week, basically. There was, most people were commuting into an office. There were some companies that were virtual or hybrid, but it was definitely the minority of days. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden you have everybody working from home. The estimate I saw was that $9 billion of energy use transferred from offices to homes. And for clients who had a 100% renewable energy goal or a net zero goal, all of a sudden that telecommuting number and that work from home number, they needed to know. And so we started helping them. But once you measure something, now you want to manage it, and now you want to do something about it. And Chris, this is what you help companies do all day. You're an expert in greenhouse gas accounting, but even more probably fun and rewarding is decarbonization strategies. So I would love to hear some examples from you of clients that you think are really leading in this area of scope 3 decarbonization, and what are some things that you're seeing them do, and what are some, if you could wave your magic wand, kind of opportunities that you would love to see leaders do?
Sure thing. So a lot to unpack there. I'd say some great examples we've seen of different companies. If we want to talk about professional services firms, we've recently just worked with a large professional services firm that is looking at how do we reduce our employee-related emissions, right? Business travel accounts for the majority of their scope 3 emissions, and they're looking to try and reduce that. So an innovative approach that others have done, but not many, is looking at internal prices on carbon, right? And so you can use that tax essentially internally to try and curve behavior. So they've looked at a couple different rollout methods, but if you give different departments set budgets and then you apply this carbon tax to them, then suddenly working within a finite budget, they'll be incentivized to fly less essentially, or be more strategic in how they fly. So there's different mechanisms that we've seen. There's carrots, there's sticks, right, to try and to incentivize behavior change within organizations. I think that's quite an interesting one. I think another really interesting anecdote is we work with a very large company that manufactures machines that are integral in semiconductor manufacturing. And they had set a very ambitious net zero target. And they were realizing very early on that it's very hard to achieve an ambitious net zero target without buy-in from your supply chain upstream and downstream. They make machines that use a lot of energy, so it's both directions for them. And so they actually looked across, and we helped them look across other industries at the pacts, that pre-competitive pacts that different industries were starting to form to try and align themselves on their ambitions and their strategies in order to decarbonize. And so they started the Semiconductor Sustainability Consortium, and through that, we've had a lot of different companies, full stack, so right, through the supply chain, sign on and align their ambitions in decarbonization efforts. And I think that type of industry-wide collaboration is really the thing that's going to drive huge amounts of change going forward. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that across industries.
That certainly reminds me of some industry efforts, in other areas as well. For example, I know one of the most fun meetings here in Boston at one point in time was called the Cup Summit, and it got together everybody who was responsible for the design, manufacturing, and ultimately disposal or recycling of cups for coffee. You just couldn't solve this problem without getting all the players in the room to be able to say, how do we create a truly closed loop system for cups? That you've got to get all these players together to make that happen. So it doesn't surprise me that these kind of industry consortiums that come together in a pre-competitive way to make this easier. You talked about and touched on something that is near and dear to WeSpire's heart, which is the connection between decarbonization and engaging employees and the value of educating employees in that process. What are your thoughts on what companies can be doing better, smarter in that area in particular? And what have you seen as some good examples of people you think are doing it well?
Yeah, great question. So I think we had talked about this before, but what I've been seeing is that there was an era of about 10 years where measurement was really the leading practice. The last 5, let's say, was target setting. And now the leaders have or are setting very detailed reduction strategies. So these are no longer broad swaths of general ideas of what they will do. These are really exact detailed plans of the costs associated, who the individuals within companies who are going to execute on these plans, the timelines for those. And so those can only be created through deep collaboration with the leaders throughout your company. So there's always leaders throughout your business at all different levels that are leading their teams and have expertise in the subjects that you need. So if you need to change the contract language for your real estate, that's a certain team. Or if you want to change your logistics, pathing, or warehouse planning for the future, that's a different team. And you need to engage deeply with those teams, educate them on the emissions that are associated with their activities, and then brainstorm and work with them to create detailed strategies in order to change your business. It cannot be done at a high level boardroom table or off with consultants. You have to, come together and, with outside help like our, South Pole or others, but you have to work with people within the business. That employee engagement is just so crucial to creating a detailed strategy that will actually change your business in a feasible but ambitious way. So that's really what we see the leaders doing right now.
Yeah, and what we really see is that if you're going to get behavior change, you have to operate on 2 fronts. One is improve people's ability to do something to decarbonize, and then the motivation to actually do it. And that a lot of times people think it's a motivational problem when it's actually an ability problem. And one of my favorite examples of this that's related to employee scope 3 is if the real estate people are picking office space that is absolutely nowhere near any sort of public transportation or shared transportation or things like that, you are going to have, not shockingly, a lot of single occupancy office commuting. But if the real estate team recognizes and is acknowledging that as you're making space decisions, access to shared transportation is a value proposition tied into those goals, they're going to make different decisions. And so the left hand has to talk to the right hand about these decisions to enable the ability, because all the marketing in the world to take public transportation, if there isn't any, doesn't help.
Yeah. Exactly. And going back to that example you just shared, the real estate team will have an existing, historical set of KPIs and constraints in which they're selecting their office spaces for, right? And so you need to understand what those are and what you need to add or what you need to change within those teams in order to incentivize them and push them towards making those decisions. Because I always say sustainability is often not the decision-making criteria in a lot of cases, but it needs to be an additional decision-making criteria, right? You're going to have financial aspects, you're going to have all these different aspects in making decisions. And if it's important, if you want change to occur, then you need to add sustainability as an additional criteria to consider within all of these different teams. So yeah, well said.
So you talked about a carbon tax, and I remember, oh gosh, it must have been 10 years ago at this point in time when Microsoft sort of pioneered flowing the carbon tax down to the different departments to sort of motivate broad decarbonization of those teams and those departments very successfully. And it was a great example. Have you seen companies, or have you, could you wave a magic wand and want to see, have you seen things where they're starting to use rewards and recognition effectively in their decarbonization strategy? So that it's, you talked about carrot and stick, so it's more carrot.
Yeah. And tax is tough. Most people don't like the word tax to begin with. And then a lot of times
Americans in particular have this tax issue. It sort of goes back to our founding revolutionary story.
Yeah, no, yeah, of course. So, it's a contentious word to begin with. And then also businesses are often so interconnected that applying a tax to a certain business line is difficult because they're so interconnected. A lot of things are going to be outside of their control, which affect the emissions associated with the business line. So anyways, small nuance on that how you structure that internal price on carbon can be challenging and often high level. But what you're alluding to, I think, is, how do you align incentives and build these sustainability goals into people's KPIs, a business's OKRs, your governance structure. And I think this is one of the things that the SEC is asking about, TCFD asks about, how often is the board involved in these things? And now TCFD is talking about risk, but, you can draw the parallel to impact, GHG impact. So yes, I think there's a lot of leading companies who have detailed strategies, and that's sort of the first step, is to have a target and a detailed strategy. And once you feel confident about that feasible but ambitious strategy, then you can layer on top, accountability for that strategy. And there's accountability at the smaller level, which is the people actually going through and doing the work, but then there should be accountability all the way up. Right. And so you can build that just into your general OKRs, as we talked about, adding sustainability as another factor in, how you measure performance. And it can go all the way to tying compensation to them as well, which we've seen some, businesses publicly talk about. So,
yeah. And we've seen that really work even when it's just tied to a component that's engagement related. We have a number of clients who have started to add either, rewards for certain behaviors or activities, or, to your point, more of a bonus structure that's tied into participation or achievement of those decarbonization goals. And I know one of the things that might be of interest to those on the webinar is that, the question often gets asked, is there any data that shows that engaging employees in our decarbonization strategy or in our climate action has a business impact above and beyond decarbonization and achieving those goals. And certainly we have worked with several clients who not only have been able to show that engaging employees in their climate efforts has a customer retention and loyalty impact, but has a revenue impact. So there's actually data showing that if you engage employees in your climate action, that translates into better customer retention and better revenue generation. So that's awesome. But the other side is that we've certainly seen that engaging employees in these programs is good for employee retention, and that employees who participate retain better than employees who don't. And even some data showing that they're more likely to be supervisors came from clients. And so certainly, we think that business case is there. Do you see in your advisory work that people are really clear on that? Or do you think that's still kind of an emerging area for companies to recognize that connection between decarbonization, engagement, and business outcomes? Is it early days, middle days?
Yeah, I think it's been known depends on the business, I would say. I think it's been known anecdotally for a while. So there's different pieces here. You're talking about internally, anytime you gather people around a common mission, whether it's the general mission of the company or whether it's ESG related, if you gather people around a common mission, typically I think studies have shown, and I'm sure you are more aware of the data than I am, the studies have shown that there's like you said, higher talent attraction, higher talent retention, just more engaged employees, probably higher net promoter scores as they talk about it. And so that's internally. And then I think externally, there has been for a while a lot of opportunities for businesses who are ambitious on sustainability to capture either new segments of the market, they're developing new types of products. There's different consumer bases that might be interested in their products for these reasons. And so there is that sort of opportunity that you're alluding to. I think the data will continue to show that most likely. A lot of data shows that consumers say they're willing to purchase products at a higher price if it's sustainability. Now there's always the contention of, someone will say they will, but will they actually? But I think there's more and more data saying, asking consumers, have you purchased a sustainable product in the last 12 months that is a higher price? And the answer is a high percentage of yes. And so I think as we move forward, those that have felt it anecdotally and are going for it are going to see that return payback.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have a wide audience here today, some whom are some of the world's leading experts. They've decarbonized the Olympics and things like that. Hi, Jill. And also folks who are just getting started. And so we've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to turn, here's a question that I think for those who have not started reporting yet on Scope 3 is, what methodologic materials, guidelines, advice do you have for folks who have not been measuring Scope 3? If they want to get started, where should they start and how do they get started?
Great question. Okay, so we're lucky. And by the way, if I don't answer your question fully, just ask a follow-up question. My vision of this is to provide value. So however I can do that for you. So Scope 3 accounting, GHG accounting as a whole, we're very lucky. There's just one standard. So there's not competing standards. It's not sitting behind a paywall. It is free and publicly available. So it's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You'll see it abbreviated as GHGP. You can just Google that, Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You can download the entire standard, and they have standard there, right, which is a very lengthy document, and you can start skimming through it and begin to understand. But there's also guidance documents on how you apply that, right? So it'll walk you category by category. There's a number of different categories within Scope 3, and you can walk through that. Once you have a general understanding of it, either you upskill yourself, get an understanding of it, you hire someone, you hire a consultancy firm like South Pole to help you with it. Where you're going to want to start is you look at the materiality, or essentially fancy word for saying like how important or useful or relevant is this category to my business. So you go through all the different categories and you say, Do I have a lot of emissions associated with this category? If the answer is yes, then you go on to measure it in more detail. If the answer is no, if it's a relatively small part, then you can make more high-level estimations for those emissions. I'm talking general rules of thumb, but that's generally how you approach it. So that's it. So there's one standard. You start with what they call a screening assessment. You look at all the different categories. You say, how relevant are they? You dive deep on your big emission sources. You use high-level estimations for your smaller emission sources, and you go from there. And every year you try to improve the granularity, and you try to improve, how you're measuring it.
So that actually leads into another question that somebody had about, since so much of scope 3 is quote unquote outside the control of the organization, is showing progress against some of the measures enough to gain positive attention by the raters?
I'm not sure who we're referring to as raters in this, but let me challenge the assumption that scope 3 is completely outside your control, right? All of your suppliers you have chosen, right? How often you fly, I mean, there's constraints on these decisions, obviously, but like you are choosing them. You have options to choose those. You choose how often your people fly, whether they are remote, virtual, what office spaces you have. There's financial impacts, of course, but I think a lot of businesses have shown you can be financially competitive while making better decisions. And so, yes, scope 3 is outside your control. Where should you start? Likely your largest areas of impact, because a small change on a large area of impact can get you a larger reduction than huge changes on a small area. Sometimes you have to do the math and be strategic about where you invest your time and money to make changes. But I'll challenge the assumption that scope 3 is entirely outside of your control. It's more difficult for sure to change suppliers' behavior than your own operations, but I'll just challenge you a little bit on that. And then, like I said, start with your biggest areas of impact. You kind of overlay, where's my biggest areas of impact? Where's my biggest ability to change them? And then where will I get the most return? There's things called MAC curves, and then you can overlay, that's like a curve of cost and impact. So you can look at how much money do I have to invest and what's the return in terms of tons of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions reduction that I would receive. So I'm trying not to go too deep, but that's generally the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you start getting into businesses that have heavy scope 3, you mentioned professional services firms, you mentioned technology companies as a good example. We certainly, scope 3 for us is big. How you get the information can be kind of challenging. We have a question here about how do you find out the emissions associated with some of the things that are kind of like buried in? Like, how do you get the emissions associated with business travel? How do you get the emissions associated with your employee commuting? How do you get the emissions associated with the energy in your buildings if your, utilities are buried in your leases and rents? So, if somebody all of a sudden is trying to report and has to go get all this data, where do they go and how do they, where do you direct them generally in those sort of big categories? The specific question was around, utilities when you don't pay for it separately, but also commuting and business travel data.
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is a huge reason why a lot of times people come to us, because we can help do all that heavy lifting for you and you can focus on decarbonizing your business. But in general, where you start is in different ways. So I hear you. I think utilities being lumped in as part of your retail footprint is a really challenging one, if that's where the comment was specifically. So we actually worked with a company where that was a challenge. They were in a bunch of different malls, and utilities were just part of their rent essentially, and they didn't have control or even insight. And even the mall owner had a hard time breaking out because it was not sub-metered at the site. And so to start, what you can do is you can start with basically, the square footage of all your sites, the types of sites they are. There is databases which you can use to estimate based on a square footage basis, right? Okay, good start. From there, you could talk to maybe, landlord and say, okay, what's the overall emissions of the entire building? Is there any people in the building that are doing high energy activity that might skew this? Like maybe there's a kitchen or a food court. Okay, they're going to have higher energy usage that might skew us. Can we strip out that data? And you try to go a bit more localized, and it's still an estimation, right? Because you're still just breaking it down, but you're trying to get closer. So this is a tiered approach, right? And then the last approach, which we actually worked with this business in doing, is saying, okay, if you're serious about this, then all new instances, all new retail footprint, they need to have a sub-meter. And as part of the contract, you need to get the data. Like that is part of it. The landlord agrees that you have access to that data. They will give you that data on a monthly basis. And so we just changed how they procured real estate essentially. And so that if you're serious, like that's how you can kind of step your way over a couple of years, maybe, or a couple of months, depending on how ambitious you are, to get there. But that general concept of starting with high level estimations to get a rough idea and then moving in the right direction over time as you can applies to really all scope 3. You just want to move quicker where you have the largest impact, because what I always say is the level of granularity you have in your measurement is the only level of granularity you have in your reduction strategy. So a good example is flights. You can measure flights based on spend. There's databases which will say you spent this much on air travel. Okay, great, there's this many emissions. The problem is now my only decarbonization effort is to spend less, which sounds great in theory because of course you want to reduce your costs of a business. But if you are growing rapidly, for example, then that can be challenging. Spending less might not be an option. Maybe you're trying to, get to your clients more or something, and you want to fly more. So if you knew the exact legs of all of your travel, and you knew even right down to the fuel usage of the planes, but that's very difficult. But if you knew like the distances traveled and all the different legs, then suddenly you can create a much more nuanced approach of flying direct, or being more strategic about who you send. And that type of thing shows that the more granular data you have on the measurement side, the more granular your approach in the decarbonization you can have. So that's why you want to step there faster with your larger impact areas.
It's even crazy things like I remember hearing that flying by day is better than flying by night for carbon emissions. And those are things that people don't necessarily know. So sometimes it's just educational. What are some strategies? We have a question here around what are some strategies that you've seen be successful for smaller companies who are working with much larger suppliers than they are, to convince them, get them to do the extra work to provide the information they need, as well as make some of the changes that they need. So how does, in a world where sometimes the business is, in the analogy of David and Goliath, the supplier is the Goliath. How does the David get them to change?
I know exactly what you mean. So that is a very common challenge. And so to reiterate that, right, you are a business, your biggest supplier and your biggest impact in your scope 3, you are only 0.1% of their overall output. And so really you don't have much leverage to ask them to change. So that is a real challenge. So you can still ask. I mean, that's the first thing, right? And you don't know, maybe if everyone else is asking, if all 100, 1% is asking, then okay, great. That is one way you can do so. You can try to provide, it depends on what you want to invest, right? Anything is possible, it's just all about money. So if you wanted to help them and subsidize on-site renewable assessment, feasibility assessment, that's a fixed cost based on the size of the site, not the size of the overall business you're dealing with. So that could be feasible for you to support if you really felt strongly. There's other ways like joining industry groups. So sometimes there's different industry groups. I know when I was at Arc'teryx, there's the outdoor industry group, and they were putting businesses together. There was a third party that would look at your supplier lists, which are highly proprietary, but there would be a third party look and help match people and say, okay, you all are sharing suppliers, and then you could pool funds and subsidize these, solar feasibility studies and things like that. So you can get together with industry groups, and ideally then you can build leverage. And the last one, which is not ideal, but you can always switch suppliers. That's a huge decision to make, obviously, and that there's a lot of consideration there, but the last one it's also an option.
And certainly, for example, for technology companies, often one of our biggest source of emissions is data centers and data hosting. And, there's a lot of decisions that go into data centers and data hosting, But certainly some of the providers have been more transparent and more of leaders in the area of renewable energy, for example, than others. And so to the extent that you begin to look at the use of renewable energy by your suppliers, if that is one of those major components for you, you don't need to necessarily know whether the company is fully net zero. What you need to know is the energy they're using for the data centers, which is the component you leverage, 100% renewable, as an example. And if you look back at the years in which the different big providers, whether that was Google or Microsoft or Amazon or whatever, you could see clear leadership or lack thereof by those different folks. They've all generally now arrived at the same place, but I did watch as it really was a combination of, frankly, activist tactics. Greenpeace flew, hot air balloons and blimps over many of the companies and sort of shamed them into reporting their data, but also just companies coming and saying, hey, we need this to be 100% renewable because we have these goals. And in all cases, they were bigger than the companies coming to them, but it ultimately influenced the industry successfully.
Yeah, and what you're alluding to too is you can get ahead of all this and ideally never be in a position to make that decision if you adapt your procurement policies and your procurement decisions to include factors like greenhouse gas emissions. Then you can ideally get in front of it.
Absolutely. There is a question that has emerged around industry collaboration and influence, but it's a little more nuanced because it's how can industry collaborate or influence the Scope 3 standard calculations with regulatory mandated Scope 3 reporting? As an industry, we have often refined the calculations to be more accurate than those that are required by regulatory bodies. How does industry sort of, I guess, push the regulators to even be more nuanced? What would you recommend there?
Yeah. Good question. So I think regulators, you can think of, you could say standard providers and you could be talking about greenhouse gas protocol, or you could say regulators and you're talking about the SEC. So SEC, that's an obvious one. They had a public open forum for that. And so that was a great opportunity to provide feedback there. I'll also say, South Pole has done reports on, let's say, nascent parts of Scope 3 accounting with different businesses. We did one around cryptocurrency a year or two ago now, where it's not for cryptocurrency mining, but it's anyone who's involved in the ecosystem of it. And we spoke with Greenhouse Gas Protocol in the background, and we talked about it, and they're open for these types of conversations around, hey, here's our research, here's our suggested methodologies, like please take this into consideration and further iterations of the standard. And so you can, as industry groups, always call them up, and they generally, if all intentions are aligned, are willing to listen. Now, this is my personal anecdotal kind of experience so far, so I wouldn't say there's like a true pathway for that, but I would encourage people, if they have developed, industry groups have developed more accurate ways they believe, then by all means, call up Greenhouse Gas Protocol and see what they say, because they might be more willing to listen than you believe.
Yeah, we had a webinar last year, 2 years, maybe it was even 2 years ago, about work from home and measuring work from home and what should be measured in a work from home environment and what shouldn't be, and had folks that were trying to really work with the GHG protocol and standard around just even, what should be in and what should be out. The other group I'll plug, having been involved with its sort of earlier incarnation, is ISSB. So I was involved with SASB and setting what the standards for measurement for the tech industry for SASB. And they also had a very collaborative process of bringing businesses and industry together to decide which questions, really were the material questions, what needed to be asked, what were the different perspectives. And so getting involved with organizations when they are giving an opportunity for industry to have a voice is probably the most, the best way to get involved. I know that the GHG, I knew this, but thank you to the person from the audience who also just shouted out that they've just completed their latest survey request to update their protocol, which is great. But they do that, which is good. Let's move to magic wand land. And let's take somebody who came to you. Let's say somebody from the audience comes to South Pole and works with you to measure and do really, really good, leading, cutting edge, detailed scope 3 measurement. If you could lay out a roadmap for them of what next, so they've gotten their measurement, they now know what's material, they know what's not, and let's assume that it is a big component of their emissions. If they want to be net zero, what would you want to see them do from there? What's the perfect client's implementation once they've done the measurement in your mind, and if there is such a thing?
That's a great question. So what next? I think, and let's presume scope 3 is perfect. No ways to improve it. Because I think that's always the thing, is like, okay,
there's always ways to improve it, but
yeah, improve your scope 3. Yeah, and automated, because I think what we see a lot when we talk about the future is that let's try to make this as seamless as possible, the reporting and measurement piece, so that you can spend more time on changing your business. So those things aside, setting a science-based target is sort of the no-brainer. For those who are not aware, the Science-Based Target Initiative is the gold standard for GHG-related targets, developed with CDP, UN Compact, WWF. So set a science-based target is the obvious solution. They have different types of targets without going into too much detail, and a net zero target, that long-term target accompanied with a short-term target, is really, that's the high bar. So waving a magic wand, let's set a net zero target that is ambitious, but achievable. In doing so, in tandem with doing that, I would also want to see the company make sure that all levels within the business, especially senior leadership at this early stage, is aware of what they're signing up for, that they fully understand how the measurements were occurring. They are part of the creation of the decarbonization strategy. They have buy-in. So often we say, what we would advise is, don't set your target and then do your strategy. Typically, you want to sort of do both at the same time. And so you're creating this decarbonization strategy. You're looking at these different target options, because there are, a couple levers you can pull and tweak to change your target slightly. And so create that strategy, create it like we talked about, with tons of employee engagement. Getting their feedback. When I'm talking about how we can decarbonization our logistics piece of a business, we better not be talking about that at a high level. I want to go talk to the people that are within that team that are making those decisions. Are these ideas feasible? What else could we do? So you do tons of employee engagement, create a really detailed, robust strategy, make sure senior leadership and the board fully understand what they're signing up for, the costs associated with this, and then you submit that target, and then you get to work.
When people are successful in that getting to work, why are they successful? And when people struggle when they're getting to that work, why do they struggle? In your experience?
Sure. I think the struggle part, I'll start. Yeah. So in my experience, in our experience, I think the reason people struggle are for a couple of different reasons. I think you said something powerful before, is it's not the understanding, but it's the actual ability to act. And I think so that's one way. If you don't have leadership understanding and buy-in fully to what you need to do, if they only partly understand that, yeah, we're doing this sustainability thing, oh, I didn't realize it was that much of a change, that disconnect can often make it challenging for people to enact strategies. So you need that buy-in and understanding up front. I think the other part too is if you try to enact a strategy from just a sustainability division and you have not engaged people, or you are not sort of disaggregating the responsibility and the accountability for the plan within the business, that can be very challenging. So if you flip that, what is successful, where do we see success? Management, understanding, buying in, and the plan is completely disaggregated, so that the sustainability team is really like a large project manager for all of these different projects that are occurring across the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take a minute and just add a piece that I've seen related to the engagement side and when it's been really, really successful and when I've seen it struggle. And there's some parallels because I absolutely agree that that engagement is key. So the first is that the engagement needs to be consistent over time, that these changes do not happen overnight. And I think there's a little bit of what I call the grand launch, and that everybody says, okay, we've set the goals and now we're going to do the grand launch. And there's a ton of time and attention around the grand launch of the goals and the strategy. And and there's a lot of attention and there's some really cool branding and there's, lots of comms and things like that. But but then attention moves elsewhere 2 months later, 4 months later, 6 months later. There's not that consistent tracking. Here's how we're doing. Here's the progress we're making. And I don't think people even realize that they're signing up for a multi-year effort that it's going to take to deliver on this. And so the grand launch gets the attention. Everybody's all excited. We're going to do this. And then 6 months later, it's like, and it was just another initiative, versus the companies that are successful. They literally bake these elements of how they're doing against those goals into everything they're doing all day long, all month long, all year long, consistently, versus the grand launch. That's, I think, one of the biggest things I've noticed. The second thing is to recognize that ESG engagement broadly is a journey, and that climate, to be most successful, it's recognizing that there's climate activity that you need to do, but there's really some really tight connections and relationships between what's happening in climate and what can happen in community, what can happen in inclusion, particularly in the area of climate justice. And when the organization starts to think strategically about how climate is connected to their social impact strategy and is connected to their inclusion strategy and their communities, that it's that much stronger because you have all these other reinforcing activities in the organization that climate is getting baked into as part of it. And they're seeing it as much more integrated. And so that starts the journey towards an integrated strategy. And then the one that just blows me away, and every single time I think delivers the most valuable, is when they really recognize the importance of bringing their customers into this journey and their suppliers into this journey. And they really see this as an ecosystem journey, not just the company's journey. And that's when we really see the transformative impact of engagement and the acceleration and kind of the flywheel towards these goals. But that's certainly the exception today, not the rule. But if I could wave my magic wand, since we're in the era of magic wands, part of today's webinar, I would say this is integrated into everything you do, from a business strategy, but also from an impact strategy, and it includes everyone that touches the organization, from customers to employees to investors to all of your partners and suppliers. And you really think about it as an ecosystem change, not just a organizational change. So what do you expect over the next couple of years, Chris, with the US potentially having every organization needing to measure and report, with EU CSR, CSRD mandating reporting in Europe? What do you think most organizations are going to find themselves needing to do that they're not doing today in the next 6 months and in the next 2 years?
Great question. I mean, yeah, if you ask me generally, what do I see for the future of this area? I always think about it as sort of, first you're raising the roof. This is what the leaders are doing, right? And then the floor kind of follows behind. And that's what we're really seeing in this moment, is that the floor is quickly catching up with all these regulations, like you're talking about, SEC, CSRD. So whether or not the SEC lands as expected, if it gets challenged, whatever happens, I think regulation is coming, right? And what's going to happen is that level of regulation is really going to standardize and make commonplace the GHG accounting part of all of this. And I think that's going to be great news, because you already see there's a lot of, automation solutions, we have partnerships with and others, and that's just going to hopefully drive a marketplace where measurement stops becoming the burdensome thing it is today, right? I think it's going to just be such a part. It's going to be like financial accounting, where it requires people in your business to do and do this, but it's going to be much more streamlined. It'll just be part of everyone's day job, like you alluded to. And it's just going to be commonplace. And what that's going to allow is it's going to allow sustainability professionals to spend more time on managing the decarbonization of their businesses. And so I think that's the really great thing. So regulation is going to come. It's going to drive, market demand for automation services for these measurement pieces, which could be GHG accounting. It could be your risk measurement. There's just going to be these tools that assist really in that. I think the other piece is risk, right? Everyone measures their greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, a lot of people do now. Not everyone measures risk.
Yeah. And
I think that's going to be a huge thing that's going to come as investors start demanding it. Like understanding the risk of your supply chain and the risk to your business that climate serves is going to be huge, and the financial impacts of that risk is going to be huge.
I think so.
There's more, but I recognize time, and so I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. We had a few final questions that we'll lob in before we wrap. So to what extent can small businesses embark on this journey? Is there a way to simplify the methodology or the process? What advice would you give to someone who is in a smaller business for doing this, and where to focus?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so it is challenging, right? Currently, we're not at that place where it's automated and simple, and so it does take resources and time, and small businesses can't always afford to divert that to that, even if they want to. So I just want to acknowledge that it is a huge challenge. I mean, shamelessly, I'll say we have Climate Huddle. You can sign on. It's aimed at smaller businesses to assist you in that estimation up front. You can simplify by starting with spend-based, right? So just look at the amount you spend on these different categories and estimate it that way. That's a great start to give you an order of magnitude estimate to know where you should start taking action. So start with the highest level data you can to get yourself rough estimates. Use tools like Climate Huddle and others to help you make those estimates. And don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. Don't look at the big companies with all their resources and the really detailed reports that they have and feel badly that you can't match that. That's not necessarily feasible or fair to make that comparison. So start where you can and just let's all get moving. And that's kind of the right direction we do that.
Absolutely. And I think you said it earlier, and I just would reiterate, which is not letting perfection be the enemy of the good. And sometimes just using logic. If you're primarily a services business and your employees travel, just start with business travel, and know that is likely to be your most material impact is commuting or business travel. Versus if you're a food company, it's likely to be how you source your ingredients, and things like that, and focus on that piece of it. My favorite story about a company that measured all of these was Levi's. And when they actually did all the measurement, what they realized is all this stuff in the middle really didn't matter. It was kind of two things: how cotton is grown and how frequently customers wash their jeans. And they reoriented their activities, around those two areas to get started. But sometimes just, using best estimate is a good place to get started. Here's a question about data.
Yeah, Susan, if I can add one thing.
Yeah, please do.
I just want to add one thing to the small business question, because I know it's such a challenging piece of frustration. I'd say the last piece of advice would be reach out to other sustainability professionals in your business, right, regardless of business size, right? I find that the sustainability professional community is so willing to help. I would be shocked if you reached out on LinkedIn if someone wouldn't give you an hour to talk through how they're doing their GHG accounting and offer some advice. broaden the network, go to some events, or just reach out on LinkedIn. People are often willing to help if you ask.
Yeah. So we had a attendee who's got a couple questions around CDP data specifically. And do you think the CDP data is accurate, or should it be revamped sooner rather than later to give users accurate measurements? And then, sort of cited some of the CDP website verification, A-list, B-list data and things like that. So sort of, does CDP play into this in your mind in a big way? No. What are some thoughts?
Yeah, you kind of just a little bit in the middle of the question, so I didn't hear the full question, but I understand it as, what are your thoughts on CDP, data accuracy, ratings, things like that. I think CDP has served as an amazing platform to galvanize broad disclosure in a consistent way. I think like any data, whether it comes out through CDP or a sustainability report, you got to look at the details. You got to look at the methodologies used. You've got to look, was it third party assured? What type of assurance? I think all those things matter regardless of where this is being reported. And so I don't think CDP, has any challenges that that other reporting frameworks don't in that regard. So I think it's an excellent platform that has really galvanized the industry around reporting. I think its role as the SEC and CSRD and other pieces come out, I think we'll likely see a lot of alignment between them so that reporting becomes easier. I think that's what we've seen with the SEC and their GHG protocol and TCFD alignment. So I assume CDP would align with other, regulatory frameworks going forward. This is just a personal hunch, but that's my general thoughts.
Absolutely. Last question, and then we'll have a couple comments, but a comment that this person gets from industry peers is that if we, quote unquote, all take care of scope 1 and 2, then scope 3 takes care of itself. Why spend millions to measure it now?
Good question. I think not everyone is measuring scope 1 and 2, and I think people might not measure scope 1 and 2 unless you've asked them to, because they are part of your scope 3. I think also, assuming everyone in the world will measure scope 1 and 2 and that the problem would solve itself if we all focused on that, I just don't know if that's realistic. I don't know if every company in every country is going to do that in a time frame that, looking at the latest IPCC report, we need to hit. So I think scope 3 is an important piece to look at. What is not just your direct impacts, but what are your indirect impacts around you? And so understanding those direct impacts and then using your influence as a purchaser from suppliers to try and incentivize suppliers who possibly would not otherwise change is necessary to drive the change in the time frame that we need to make the change.
Yeah. And what I would say is, I think that can be said accurately, potentially, if everybody were reporting for scope 1 and 2, but there's still the employee related that you own that wouldn't necessarily be covered, and the product usage, that is part of scope 3 as well. And so there's other areas of scope 3 that measuring other companies' scope 1 and 2 don't capture, the consumer usage and the employee related. So that's why everybody should get started, is because those things matter and can sometimes, as in the case of Levi's, matter the most, and all of that. Well, one of the things I just want to put a plug for is something that we have gotten incredibly positive feedback from employees about, and that is that, as I mentioned, South Pole, in addition to the area Chris leads, which is all the measurement and consulting around how to decarbonize your business, they have projects, and these are decarbonization projects, and they have the offset component to this, which is integrated into the WeSpire platform. And one of the things that employees, when we measure their footprint, they're given the opportunity to reduce their footprint by taking and doing actions to reduce their footprint, but they're given the opportunity, or their company can choose to purchase offsets to offset their footprint, people love those projects, Chris. You know, and it's really fun to see what employees gravitate towards, whether it's, you know, koala habitat restoration or cook stoves, you know, in developing communities and villages, which has the whole benefit for women's health and children's health as well. So one of the things we've really found is that the process of people learning about offsets and understanding offsets gets them even more engaged in their company's decarbonization strategy. When they start to really understand, oh, this is how I can reduce my own personal footprint and then offset the rest. Now I get what my company's doing and why they're trying to do it. And so just a shout out to South Pole for just having some great projects that people really love. So I know that's not your part of the business, but I just wanted to, before I said thank you for joining us today, to just share that. And if anybody needs help measuring scope 3 broadly, South Pole does that. If you need help with the employee component, WeSpire does that, and we'll connect you into those great projects. And if you have any questions that we did not get to today, although we had tons of questions and I think got to most of them, please do not hesitate to reach out. We are very, very open to answering anything you've had afterwards. Chris, it was great to have you on WeSpire Live. Thank you so much for sharing your just infinite knowledge, wisdom, and experience about what this brave new world is going to be as this gets more and more mandated and regulated. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone. Take care.